Hello, thanks for joining me for today's video. Today we're going to be doing another real-time tutorial. I'm going to be doing a little seascape using a new sketchbook that I purchased. This one is a Baohong sketchbook. This is 100% cotton watercolor paper and it's 300 GSM. So it comes in this little, I think it's a faux leather binding. I bought this one from Sienna's Art Supplies in Melbourne. And this will be the first time I'm trying this paper. I'm using this sketchbook, so let's really test it out and see what it's got. I normally like to tape down the edges of my watercolor paper with some masking tape. So to use this first page, I am definitely going to do that because it's not going to sit in place if I don't. So I'm just going to use a really fine, not very wide masking tape here. So I'm just going to tape that now before we get started. I just wanted to quickly jump in here and say what materials we would be using today. So we're using the Baohong Academy Watercolor Sketchbook. This is 100% cotton watercolor paper in a sketchbook. You can use whatever watercolor paper you have. I would highly recommend, if you can, swing 100% cotton. 300 GSM is nice too because it's a bit thicker and it won't buckle as much on you. And there are lots of different versions available of those specifics for the watercolor paper, so you don't need to spend an absolute fortune. Happy to list some alternatives down below. So we're using this sketchbook today. I'm using a limited palette of watercolors. These are core watercolors. I only have 6 colors in the core. I basically got the introductory set. So there's 6 colors. I actually only use 4 of the colors. The colors I have are Hansa Yellow Light. We have Pyrrole Red, Permanent Alizarin Crimson. This is Phthalo Blue, the green shade, Ultramarine Blue, and Burnt Sienna. I don't touch the reds today, just the yellow, the blues, and the Burnt Sienna. So I wanted to try and keep this to as limited colours as possible, and I might try and continue to do this for the series of these real-time watercolour tutorials. So if you do want to follow along and you don't have many supplies, or you wanted to start out, I'm not overwhelming you with the amount of products that you need to have. So hopefully that is helpful. So paints, I have a mechanical pencil, just a regular, whatever kind of pencil you have, just to sketch out some lines. Doesn't need to be mechanical, it can be whatever you have. And then I've got some white gouache for highlights and a white gel pen. You don't need to have both. I just was trying to get a little bit more detail using this one, but ended up using some of the gouache as well. I've just, because my little palette is quite tiny, I do have a little ceramic plate here that I'm just mixing my colors on. This is literally something from Kmart. It was very cheap just to buy just a big white plate. You could just use a white plate out of your cupboard, or you could use a plastic plate, or if you have a palette already, whichever you like. Masking tape, I've just used a little bit of masking tape to tape the edges of my paper just to hold it in place, and we get a nice crisp border on our painting. And a little water bucket with my 2 sides dirty and clean water. You could just use 2 cups or old jars, whatever you have for your water bucket. Oh, and some paper towel to dab off my paint. And I just quickly wanted to show you what it is that we'll actually be painting today. So we're going to do a little seascape, and this is what we'll be painting. So that's why we've only used those 4 colors. We've just got some green in our land and our water and sky, and it's all quite basic. So I just thought this would be a nice sort of beginner project. Anyway, let's get to painting. Okay, now I've got my paper all taped down with my masking tape. I'm just actually propping the cover of my sketchbook against a little drink bottle to my left here, because the way that the sketchbook is bound, the very first page seems to be a little bit more connected to that little cover paper that's not watercolour paper, so it was causing this to lift up awkwardly. So I'm just propping the lid, the cover up. Doesn't seem to be a problem for the second page, so hopefully that won't be an issue going forth with this sketchbook. Okay, so first off, I'm just going to use a mechanical pencil just to sketch out my rough plans for my painting here. So I'm just going to roughly draw in a little horizon line. I don't want to be too careful with this, so I'm not bothering with a ruler today. We have some trees and things here, but I'm just going to paint those in. I'm not going to sketch them in. And the way that the coastline curves in my reference here, it comes around like this. This is just a rough guide. We can always you can always add more details with your paintbrushes, or if you prefer to do a more detailed sketch, by all means feel free to do that. I'm keeping this incredibly loose. I don't want to get too caught up, and I'm sorry if you can barely see that on the camera. It might not be picking up the graphite very well. Again, okay, that's all I'm going to use as a guide for my painting today. Just some lines just to indicate roughly where I want my land, my sky and my sea. Okay, so just going to start by adding in the sky first. So I'm going to start by mixing up a watered down version of some Phthalo Blue. Now, to get a nice smooth blend, what we can do is wet our sky just with some nice clean water. This will just help blend so we get a nice even distribution of the paint. Thing to bear in mind, if you add a lot of water to start off with, you will get a larger colour shift when the paint dries. Alright, so now that I've got my sky in, I'm going to start in with my water, and I'm actually not going to use a wet on wet blending technique. I'm going to go in with straight paint. I can water it down on my palette just to mix out the colour a little bit. I'm not too concerned about them bleeding together because it is the same colour, and you'll often have reflection of the sky in the water. The water acts a little bit like a mirror. Now the way that in my reference here that I'm following, the water kind of goes a little bit more green here. There's actually a lot of white in the photo that I'm following along with. So I'm going to mix in a little bit of, this is Hansa Yellow Light, in with my Phthalo Blue. Get this nice pretty green. And I'm going to start blending that into the blue as well. So when I say there's a lot of white in this painting, it's the shore, the way that the waves are crashing onto the beach. There's a lot of white of the ocean there. I might not do quite as much white. This is where we can use our artistic license to change up the painting to suit our needs. It serves us, not the other way around. I'm just drawing in the rough sort of shapes of the water, and I'm using the very tip of the brush. This is a round brush, so it's got a nice point, and you can flatten it out like so to get more surface. Using the belly of the brush you can create a broader stroke. These are a nice versatile brush, very good for watercolour. Now, the way that the wave is coming in my photo here, it comes around in the middle here, and we have some more blue in here. I am going to be just painting this quite loosely today. I just want to create a nice quick little landscape or water seascape, just to test out this new sketchbook, these paints, and just have a bit of fun doing some painting. And hopefully this will be helpful to anyone watching. So we can add a little bit more paint, sort of building some layers to create a little bit of interest in our water here. So again, just mixing our Phthalo Blue with a bit of our Hansa Yellow light. Got too much yellow. It's quite green. Now once the paint is dry on the page and we continue to build up our layers, it won't feather out so much because the paint is still wet here. So then we can start getting a little bit more detail where we want to apply it. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my blue on its own, the Phthalo Blue. And I'm just going to draw in basically where I want this wave to be. I'm not too concerned about that blue line because I'm going to make it blend into this blue part of the water here. I'm trying to keep my strokes going in this sort of direction so that it looks like the water is coming in. So just be mindful of how you're applying your paint if you're trying to draw in some lines like this, because you wouldn't want to be starting to add in lines like this because it would take away from the direction that you're trying to establish in the painting. Just to blend out here, I'm just like tapping my paintbrush up to the line that I drew before, and then continuing to do my little side to side motion. So what I'm going to do is water down that phthalo blue to a very light wash. And I'm just going to even lighter than that. I'm just going to fill in a little bit of this white space. I don't want it to be white everywhere. Okay, and with that same colour, that really light wash of blue, I'm going to start adding in into the white part here some really tiny little spots of blue so that we can see the ocean underneath the sea foam. Sorry, I forgot what the word was for a second. Now we can build this up afterwards. We can add a little bit more contrast by adding some layers, but I just wanted to pop this in here so we get a rough idea of what we're looking at. Try not to keep it too sort of in one area to make it look like, you know, basically one big line. So I'm just sort of jumping around a little bit. I'm going to go back to my stronger blue and start layering in some blue into this green here because that's a little bit more green than I would like. And again, just going with those side to side motions. I'm not looking too closely at my reference. I'm not trying to get every tiny little detail exactly the same. This is just an indication of water on the beach, basically. Impression. Obviously, if you're following along with this, you can go as detailed as you like. Spend a good amount of time on it. You can add lots and lots of details. Up to you. Now I'm going to go over the blue in the background here now that it's not completely dry yet, but gets drier and with a more bold, more undiluted form of the paint, because I want this to be a lot darker in the background. We want to have some contrast. Okay, I think I'm going to leave the water for now and move on to the beach. Okay, so I'm going to use some burnt sienna. And I'm going to mix some of that burnt sienna with my Hansa Yellow light. So we've got a lighter version with a bit more yellow into it. Now in my reference, I can sort of see basically 3 different colours within the shoreline. So we've got a reflection where the water is hitting, where it's hit the shore and or the beach, and then it's drawn back a bit. So we've got the light reflecting on it. Then we've got where the beach has been wet, and then further back where it's dry. So I'm going to start back where it's dry with our lighter colour. So that's my burnt sienna and yellow mix. Okay. And then next I'm going to go in with my just watered down burnt sienna. Going right up against that line. It's going to bleed together because the yellow mix is still wet. Sorry, forgive me my reference. I'm using my phone to look at the reference photo. The screen just went black. Now I can draw in some like little rough shapes in the beach. Again, establishing that same direction. Okay, now for the part here where we've got the wet sand reflecting, I'm going to add in some of my little bit of phthalo blue in with some burnt sienna. This will make a grey kind of colour, or a neutral colour because of the orange tones that are in the burnt sienna. And that's a contrasting colour against blue. So that's something good to know if you want to tone down some colour. So if your blue's a little bit too bright, you want to neutralise it a little bit, you could add in some orange. And vice versa. Okay, so now I'm going to draw in some of that colour. Right up against that seafoam line. So I'm going to need to bring my burnt sienna mix down a bit further. I just wanted to pop that in because I didn't know how far I wanted to bring that down. Now I really should have done that all in one motion so that I've got like a nice clean wash, but it's too late for that now. So I'm just trying my best to work over the already established layer of burnt sienna. Just to try and blend it out a little bit more. A little bit more beach at the top of the painting there. Okay, so the next part I'm going to work on is the trees and grasslands and stuff, that'll seagrass that's in the painting here, and it is quite dark in the reference. So I'm going to be mixing up my phthalo blue with a bit of yellow, and then I'm going to add in a little bit of the burnt sienna as well, because I don't want, you know, this really bright green that I'm mixing here. I'm going to add a little bit more of the blue. And now we've got a nice, kind of like an evergreeny green. So I can start adding in some of my trees, and I'm just tapping the brush just to make some tree shapes. And then we can bring some of that green down. I do these kind of scribbling motions to try and add some sort of texture, but it's kind of, because it's all wet, it's also really blending in together, so. What we'll do is we'll layer over the top of this, because this is really just a base layer here. Sometimes it's still helpful to try and establish these shapes early on, depending on the kind of paper you're working with or the kind of paints you're working with. Some paints are a staining paint, so they really mark the paper where you can't remove it easily or blend it out, or if you're using a hot press paper, it's sometimes hard to blend out, especially if the paint has dried on you. So sometimes you can use that to your advantage by popping in some of those little shapes underneath that you can glaze some paint over the top. And glazing is just where once the paint is dry, we mix, could be another colour that you want to add on top, and a diluted version of that to change the tint of the colour you've already established. I'm going to let this side dry now, and I'm going to go back over to the water. If you use the back of your hand to touch the paint, if it feels cold, it's still wet. This feels maybe like it's slightly damp, but not too damp. Okay, now I'm going to mix more of my Phthalo Blue, and I'm actually going to add in a little bit of our burnt sienna. So I want to darken up my blue without it being too brown or too blue. So I think I've got a good colour there now, because I want to darken this up a little bit more. It's looking a little bit too blue for my liking. So I've got quite a pretty colour here now. Just going to layer that on top of my blue. We're going to add a bit of contrast here. Okay, so that's darkened that up quite nicely now. Using that same colour, just a little bit more diluted with water, I'm going to add in a little bit more darkness down here, because there seems to be like a little dark patch in the water. Again, I'm sticking to those side-to-side motions. Rinsing off my brush, I'm going to just even out some of this in the centre there. So I think while both of these areas are still drying, this might be a good time to start adding in some little rocks and things that are along the shoreline. And we're going to mix our own black, really by just using our burnt sienna and phthalo blue. Now, normally I would use an ultramarine blue to make a nice grey, but I'm trying to keep this to as sort of limited colours as we can here. And again, I'm just going to keep mixing until I find the colour that I'm really looking for. I'm going to start scattering in some rocks just in the beach here as well. Now we've got in here, we've got all these rocks that are actually coming out. Rocks and grass and stuff further down here. So I'm going to tap those in as well. And I'm going to be darkening up all of this. And now that we've established that sort of base layer of paint, we can add a bit more texture as we're going along. It's getting pretty dry there now. So I'm going to go back over all our trees over here, add a bit more depth by layering some more colour over the top. I just mixed a little bit more of my burnt sienna into that mix, so we've got a little bit more brown this time. I'm going to go back and forth in between using the burnt sienna mix in with more of the phthalo blue. This just helps add a little bit of variation. Yeah, you can if you've got a rough or a medium textured paper, you can use some of the paper's texture to your advantage here as well. So on the side of this part of the brush, I'm just sort of scraping along in a dry brush technique, so the paint, there's not so much water on the paint, it's more paint, and then it hits the raised surface of the watercolor paper, so it's not seeping in because it's too wet, and it's not getting to the bottom levels of the little dips, so we get a little bit of texture. Don't overwork it because it will start to get down to those lower crevices in the paper. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix in a little bit more of our yellow mix, glazing this in here to fill in those little white parts that I'd left before. I just spilt a bit of water there. Okay, so we've basically got our base layers of our painting in, and now I'm just going to let this dry. You could hit it with a heat tool or a hair dryer and let the painting dry, and then we'll go back in and add a few more details. Okay, I've just dried my painting, so I'm going to switch to a smaller brush now. This is a number 6 round. And I know I was trying to avoid using too many colours, but I have decided to introduce the ultramarine. I just feel like I'm not getting quite dark enough. The dark enough kind of grey colour that I'm going for. So I'm going to start using the ultramarine mixed in with my burnt sienna. And we can make a nice grey colour. I'm also trying to make a mixture that's not too watered down. I want more of the bold colour. So I'm just dabbing off and wiping my brush, taking some of the moisture out after cleaning it before I pick up new paint to mix. Okay, so I feel like that's not really enough paint. So I'm just going to keep mixing until I've sorted myself out here. Okay, fingers crossed that's a bit better. Alright, so I'm going to go back in to my trees here, and I'm just going to try and really darken those up a bit. And now that I've switched to a smaller brush, this will be easier to get it a bit darker too, because the bigger brush, even though we can get that really nice fine point, it can also hold a lot more water, so that can mean that even if you've dried out the brush, you've wiped it on your paper towel or your rag, whatever you're using, it can still hold a bit of water, and that can, as you're painting, kind of stem down to the tip of the brush, so it ends up diluting your paint. I hope this is making this a bit darker. It seems to be. So again, just continue with the same painting motions, just tapping to create the little leafy textures in the distance, and branches and leaves. It's the beauty of painting landscapes and things like that. You don't need to get too caught up in the details, especially if you're in the distance. Then we can start adding in some sort of bush shapes over here. Might be some little bushes on the next to the beach. And I'm not going to go all the way to the shoreline, because I want the darker shapes to be pushed to the back. Just helps us create sort of an illusion of depth. I'm bringing some of that dark just to break this shape up down here. It's really just scribbling in the basic shapes of like little rocks or little bushes, or, I mean, it's so in the distance, who knows what's up there. Could be people standing around or anything. I'm going to soften out this here at the front as well. kind of working in some of the colour I mixed earlier, some of the green, and I've just added in a little bit of our burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, grey mix. I'm kind of just scribbling back and forth, trying to get it to blend just a little bit, so it's just not so sort of harsh brush strokes. We do have some rocks and things. I've already established some of those, but I'm going to just draw in some more of those. These could even be clumps of grass back there as well. I imagine they are, actually, being so close to this. That little tree stump type, or bush stump things. Okay. Now I'm going to step away from, oh, actually no, I'll add a bit more detail down here. Back again in with our grey mix. Now if you're painting along with this and you find that you're just not getting those darks quite dark enough, I don't object to you using black paint. If you can't get that contrast in there, don't be afraid to use it. Or don't be afraid to mix your media and start adding in some coloured pencils or pastels on top if you have them handy. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a bit of a very light wash of a blue over a lot of this white. And I'm going to go in over the top and add, it sounds kind of productive, add some of those whites back in with some white gouache. So just picking up some blue, really watered down. I'm not going to go over all of it. I'm just going to just fill in some of those white gaps. There's something about just being able to lay white paint on top, or a lighter colour like using gouache, that just helps create a different sort of depth. Another thing that you could do here is you could, before you start the painting, if you have masking fluid, you could draw in and preserve those whites. Let it dry and then basically paint around it and then remove the masking fluid once you're all done and it's all dry. I've done that with a watercolour sort of shoreline painting like this before. You could even use a gel pen for a little bit more control if it's a small painting like this. To add in those little whites. Or a Posca paint pen. The beauty of having those sorts of items in your watercolour kit is being able to have a little bit more wiggle room for correction, or adding in highlights after if you haven't reserved them with a masking fluid in the beginning. Masking fluid can be a bit of a hit or miss kind of product to use sometimes. If you use it on good quality paper, you don't generally have an issue, but if you use it on some of the cheaper papers that aren't quite as robust, the masking fluid or even masking tape can sometimes tear, which if you've painstakingly taken all that time to mask your painting and then then you go to remove it after you've let it dry and add in all your layers. It can be quite heartbreaking if it ruins your painting. That happened to me recently. I used it on some, I think it was a mixed media paper. Took all the time and effort, waited for it to dry properly, painted in my background, was really happy with it, and then went to remove it and it completely destroyed the subject that I was painting. Lucky for me, I had scanned it ahead of time so that it wasn't completely lost to me. I could try again. But yeah, upsetting nonetheless. Okay, I'm just going to dry this again now. Okay, now that my painting's, that's all dry, I'm going to, I might even just start with some white gel pen before I resort to my gouache. Now the problem here is, in order to get the white to show up, this really does need to be quite dark, and I don't think that that is really dark enough underneath there. So, sorry to be so back and forth here. I am actually going to paint in a little bit more with my Phthalo Blue. I could try and painstakingly draw in like little every dot here, I guess. I could start doing that. This will just help really bump that contrast, make that white really white and stand out. Try not to get too carried away with my little lines here. In the span of about 2 seconds, I temporarily lost my paintbrush because I accidentally dropped it on the floor. So I've got to switch back to my smaller brush now. I've found it and cleaned it. I don't want these to be too much and too dark in here. It's really hard to try and find that balance. But that's what layers are for, and what the white gel pen is for, or the white gouache, whichever you have. Or your masking fluid techniques. Actually going to mix in some of our nice green mix. Just to change those colours up just a little bit. I'm just doing all these little tiny little scribbly lines. We kind of get these like longer strokes towards the back here. Like I said, these sorts of paintings you can make them as complicated or as simple as you like. There's a lot of detail in this photo. And as I said at the start, I'm trying not to get too caught up in capturing every little detail, but I do want to add some. Now because we didn't use a lot of water just then, I don't think this is going to be too wet to try and start going in and adding some of our other white details with the gel pen or the gouache. I'm going to start really on this sort of shoreline, and again scribbling again in that same side to side motion. We want consistency there, and just scribbling in. Might use some gouache on here and use some of the gel pen. I just wanted a little bit more control by using the gel pen, as it is such a small area. But sometimes they're a little bit finicky to use depending on what your project is, what you're using them on. Try not to go overboard with the white highlights out in the distance there. You can even do some like little scribbly motions, especially down here, because we've got some of those kinds of shapes in the water. Just drawing like little snaky type shapes. Adding a little bit of white over some of the rocks, like it's coming up onto the rocks. And these are some of the details that possibly are getting quite lost on the camera there. Definitely going to use a little bit of the gouache just for this. Not just to add the colour in, but just to add a little bit of texture. And I'm not dilating that paint down, I'm using it as straight white gouache, not a lot of water. And just tapping on some of that gouache. If you went a bit too overboard with your blue, paint straight over the top. Again, you can use some of the texture of the paper. You want to add in a little bit of variation, just doing that dry brush technique again. Jumping around a bit because I try not to get too caught up in one area and then I end up going overboard, and it's a whole big thing. I really feel like now's the time to just stop fussing with it. My best advice when we get to a point like this in our paintings is when we feel like we're adding too much or don't really know what else to do, or if something looks off to you, walk away from it for a while. You can, an hour, a couple of hours, a day, a week, however long you want to gain a little bit of perspective. However, for the purpose of this video today, I'm just going to leave this one here. I'm just going to dry it and remove my masking tape. And I just wanted this to be a quick little study and something that we could do a little bit of a real-time tutorial along. Hopefully you painted along with me or save this to paint at a later date. I hope you enjoyed this painting today. I want to thank you so much for watching. If you do have any suggestions of tutorials that you would like to see in the future, real-time, or if you prefer them to be sped up, like a more quick time-lapse and briefly talking through the process, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. I'd love to have your feedback so I can make the kind of content that you guys want to see. So thanks for watching. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.